need to do is get transfers from different locations, and these locations presumably are not affected because it's a different type of economic activity that's going on in these other locations. What you have in a more localised economy is you get more activities going on in all locations and less specialisation in each of them. So perhaps you're less prone to a shock, but you're also you're maybe not fully taking advantages of the benefits of specialisation, and you don't have as many resources maybe that you could transfer regionally. So there's definitely arguments both ways.
So you would you might not lose so much in the shock, but you might not gain as much in the boom.
Possibly, yeah.
Interesting. With current relations that exist between Scotland and England economically, given independence, the scare stories about taxes to move things across borders and things, with a bit of goodwill, is there any particular reason why the current arrangements shouldn't continue to exist or even be improved?
I think it's likely that relationships will degrade over the course of generations, perhaps accepting the fact we don't know how the sort of European integration project is going to pan out in the long run. But what you do see, if you look at countries, borders are quite important. Borders actually do have an impact on, say, trading relations. And this is not sort of explained by real costs. There doesn't have to be tariffs associated with the border. There doesn't have to be border posts. There can be apparently nothing associated with this border, but it seems to have an influence on observed cross-border flows. And I don't think the Scotland-England border will generate any particular impediments post-independence. But what you might see over the course of several generations is that the business networks, say, are such that they are more domestically focused, whereas at the moment they might be slightly more cross-border focused. So I think you will sort of see the relationship between Scotland and the rest of the UK start to look more like the relationship that you see between any independent countries. So a good example of this perhaps is the level of trade integration that there was between Ireland and the UK following Irish independence. And it was very, very, very high. And it slowly declined, and now Ireland still is very close to the UK in trade terms, but it's not as close as Scotland is to the rest of the UK, and it's only marginally above the way that France is or the way that other close countries are. So the Irish UK border is starting to look like a normal international border, and eventually the rest of the UK border will look presumably similar. The possibility maybe is that eventually the European Union starts to look like a sort of United States of Europe, and we're all very integrated. But that process has only sort of just begun, if indeed it is a process at all.
Is it necessarily negative to have more trade inside your own country between different groups, given that, you used Ireland as an example? Ireland, despite the crash, seems to be back up above the UK in many of the indicators if you look through some of the economic reports.
Not at all. I mean, what you want to be is an open economy. You want to have external trading relationships all across the world. So the fact that Scotland is very focused on the rest of the UK market is not necessarily a good thing. The level of integration that Scotland has with the rest of the UK does give it access to a large market, though. And Scotland would have to replicate this large market with the rest of the world. And new relationships have got to be formed to do that. It's just that in the long run, Scotland won't focus its efforts so much on the rest of the UK as it does at the moment. And potentially there's losses associated with breaking up these closely integrated relations. But again, there could be benefits with developing closer relationships with other parties. There is no evidence that smaller countries are poorer, and this is an issue that pertains to small countries.
Yeah, because in the Scandinavian countries, do they tend to export a lot abroad, or is it just between themselves? And if Scotland wants to join this Nordic group, is that a way to go? If trade with England starts to decline over generations, as you suggested, would moving to be part of this Nordic group be a possibility?
I don't know how focused their trade is with each other, but they are open economies. So they are the sort of classic example of small open economies, and they trade worldwide, and they do very well. So I don't see that there's any reason why Scotland wouldn't be like that in the very, very long run. So, I mean, people's concerns about the long run, I think, are probably unfounded. People are maybe more legitimately concerned about the sort of transition of how do we get there.
Just to move on to another topic, you'll have read the economic section in the SNP white paper. Do you think it's being realistic?
I read the white paper as a manifesto, essentially. It didn't strike me as sort of any more or less realistic than anybody's manifesto coming into an election. It was a manifesto that had a lot of interesting policies in it. I don't think that they're unrealistic at all, essentially any more than the coalition government's perspective is unrealistic. There was no obvious howlers in there that say, oh, you just can't do this. I'm not sure it was at the same level of detail as a civil service type piece of primary legislation. But in terms of it being a manifesto, it was absolutely fine, I think.
And on the IFS report, which was quite critical of the prospects, in some ways, of an independent Scotland, one of the best criticisms I heard of it was that it was pointed out that certain things could be very difficult for Scotland in the future. And then I heard someone mention that, well, yeah, that's if an independent Scotland continues to follow to the letter what the UK government is doing at the moment. Do you think that's fair?
That's being a bit too specific in terms of to the letter. What the IFS report had, I mean, essentially the IFS report was a demographic projection. And the demographics that they chose to use were the low migration scenario from the Office of National Statistics. And the reason they chose the low migration scenario from the Office of National Statistics is that they felt that was most consistent with current UK government policy. So it's all related to the narrative in the coalition government statements and in the media about immigration. And what the IFS report did was set a long-term target for debt to GDP of 40% in 2062, I think. And they made very sort of middle-of-the-road assumptions and said, what is the level of fiscal tightening that the UK has to do to meet that level of debt to GDP ratio? And what is the level of fiscal tightening that Scotland has to do? And the Scotland that they were looking at was the kind of GERS Scotland. So GERS is the Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland report produced by the Scottish Government, which kind of looks at the current Scottish Government finances as if Scotland was independent, but it's the current ones. So it's trying to construct sort of national accounts for Scotland, as Scotland is at the moment, but report them as if Scotland was independent. So the IFS was just projecting forward these GERS numbers using very central assumptions, and they came up with a much bigger fiscal tightening that Scotland would have to do relative to the UK. And the reason for this was that Scotland's demographics under this Office for National Statistics projection was we were going to have a smaller workforce as a percentage of this population and a higher pensioner population as a percentage of the overall population. And that's a function of the demographics, purely and simple. There's very little sort of economics in there. It's purely a demographic calculation. And I don't think you can have any real complaints about this exercise that they went through. It's an entirely reasonable exercise. What needs to be borne in mind, though, is that this demographic issue that Scotland has is an issue that Scotland will have whether Scotland is independent or whether Scotland is part of the UK. And to claim that this is a real indictment of independence is to sort of miss the point of it almost. What the IFS report showed was that demographics are really quite important. And the two scenarios kind of that you can imagine are the Union one, where current UK government policy stays in force and we are in this low migration scenario. And what has to happen then, if there's to be none of this extra fiscal tightening in Scotland, is that Scotland has to actually get all these transfers from the rest of the UK. So if you believe in the future that Scotland will be heavily subsidised, then Scotland won't have to make these big fiscal cuts. If you don't believe that Scotland will be heavily subsidised within the Union, in a way that it's not been heavily subsidised in the past, then these cuts that the IFS were saying were necessary in an independent Scotland are actually cuts that are going to have to be made in a Scotland that stays in the UK anyway. On the converse side, if Scotland's independent and it implements policies that mean that this low migration scenario still is the appropriate one to use, then Scotland, clearly has to make large cuts in order to afford the pensions and to make up for the lower taxes it's got from its lower workforce. But an independent Scotland may have additional policies that it can implement, which might mean that this low migration scenario is not the appropriate one. And the white paper does talk about an aspiration for a more liberal immigration policy. Whether that is spin again or whether that would really be implemented by the Scottish population after independence, I don't know. But it's obviously an option that an independent country has to try and attract more immigrants and to try and reintroduce student visas, as the white paper talked about, and policies that might mean that the low migration scenario didn't actually come true and we had a working age population, a larger working age population in future made up of a decent level of immigration.
I think politically it's a very divergent position between Scottish Government, which doesn't have the power to do that at the moment, and the UK Government, which seems to be swinging, as you said, to the low migration side. And there's even talk about sort of Tories and UKIP working together, and it seems to be a very different scenario. But to move on to a topic that's never really come up in the independence debate before, which is the European Union. I mean, I've never heard anyone mention it in this whole debate so far. First of all, we can start with the kind of first principles here. What are the benefits from being in the EU? Firstly, for the UK, and secondly, for an independent Scotland.
The UK in the EU, I mean, the EU fundamentally has grown. The institutions of the EU have grown to provide free movement of goods and labour, and to a much lesser extent money across borders. So to the extent that you think free movement and integration is a good thing, then the institutions of the EU are trying to enable that and to implement that. So the UK benefits from this free movement of labour to the extent that it's received a large level of immigration to the past, and the economics seem to suggest that such immigration is beneficial. And going back to the previous point about the importance of demographics, the UK has a problem of an ageing population which is massively bigger than the difference in the problem between Scotland and the UK. So Scotland has a problem of ageing population, and the UK has a problem of an ageing population. Scotland's problem is slightly worse, but the difference between Scotland and the UK is much, much smaller than the absolute level of the problem that the UK has. So the UK benefits from this immigration. It benefits from an integrated market. The trade benefits of EU membership are not actually very obvious, though. I mean, the stated purpose is to have this single market, and the single market should be a good thing. And it may be the case that the comparators that you can look at are actually sort of free riding on the existence of the single market. But if, for example, you look at the level of trade between Sweden and the EU and Norway in the EU, so Sweden's in the EU and Norway's not, you don't see much difference. If you look at the level of trade between Iceland and Finland, again, Iceland's not in the EU and Finland is in the EU, you don't see a huge amount of difference. Likewise, Austria and Switzerland, one of which is in the EU, one of which is not. So the integration benefits of the EU, whilst the institutions sort of enshrine them, they're not actually all that apparent from the data. And presumably those advocating exit from the EU for Britain are looking at things like that and saying, well, if we just join the European free trade area like Iceland and Norway, then we get any benefits that are going in. The EU itself doesn't have any additional benefits. I think that's possibly free riding on the institutions of the EU, and if everybody had took that attitude, then the single market would unravel to a certain extent. But there's another sort of more signalling thing about the EU with its minimum standards for human rights and labour laws and perhaps left of centre political issues, which is clearly one of the drivers for some on the right of UK politics to want to leave. And it's likely that Scotland would, given the predominance of Labour and the SNP in Scotland, would want to signal that it wasn't sort of going against those political symbols of human rights in the social chapter. So it's likely that Scotland would want to join for symbolic reasons, it's obviously likely that Scotland wants to partake of the single market, and is therefore likely to, and that is a very important thing, but as discussed, it's maybe not so clear that the EU itself provides the benefits of the single market more than the European